Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast, and tonight I'm talking with the most demanded guest ever. Whenever I ask on Twitter whom should I interview, the name Andrew Snyder has come up over and over and over. And after months of trying to make it happen, he's here tonight. Andrew Snyder is professor of philosophy and founder of the Mythic Mind Fellowship. Thank you for doing this, Andrew.
Absolutely. I'm glad that we are finally making it happen.
How's it going for you?
Yeah, it's going well. I'm always super busy. I've got my teaching on campus 3 days a week, teaching online. I've just recently started writing a book, and I've got twin 3-year-olds now, and so there's always so much going on here.
And also, you dominate Inkling's Twitter.
Yeah, I try to do my part in that space.
How is Twitter treating you?
My experience overall has been very positive on Twitter. I think that you really get out of it what you put into it. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, especially if you send out that tweet that get some rounds, eventually you start to get the crazies. But for the most part, if you're looking for a positive experience, you find it, and that's largely what I found.
I have provoked the crazies on a number of occasions, and it's fascinating if you can step back and not be offended. But it's fascinating to just see the level of assumption that people make about you.
So many people are just ideological robots where, they see everything through one particular lens. If you don't fit within that scope, then obviously you're, the most extreme version of their enemy. It's a total binary way of seeing the world. And I think that's just kind of, there's something very natural about that in a negative sort of sense. And I think that the Twitter space, social media space, really just continues to propagate that temptation that we have to be so limited in the way that we understand people, because it's so easy to limit your scope to hearing the things that are just going to continue to kind of feed back into this ideology you already possess. And at that point, you start to think that, well, maybe these pretty fringe ideas I've learned to embrace, maybe that's actually mainstream, right? And so then you start to treat pretty mainstream, more moderate positions as if they're fringe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think too that I've written a lot on Twitter about ideology as well, and kind of what I think it is. And as you say, it's the sort of the adopting of maybe fringe positions, but we can have mainstream ideologies too, insofar as ideology is a substitute for real engagement with the world, because it is through the embrace of ideology we make part. That is one of the ways we avoid becoming a real self.
Right. It's really a shortcut to a kind of artificial order versus
artificial identity. Yeah.
Right. Versus working through just the chaos that is existence, right? And coming to understand who you are in relation to the world that you're experiencing. It's far easier to shortcut that self-formation and just impose this ideology that isn't even really your own. Right, you kind of become possessed by it rather than a possessor of it.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording about Jacques Ellul and his conception of propaganda, and this is exactly what he says. Propaganda. We tend to think of propaganda as certain media products that exaggerate for an evil purpose, but Ellul talks about essentially that propaganda is a continuous intellectual environment that substitutes for religion and keeps the sort of the middle level person satisfied. And that's kind of where we are. What is it that you think that helps us to break out of that and form a real self?
I think that part of it is simply stepping back and recognizing that even reality itself has a fundamental order to it, and I'm convinced that it does. Uh, our experience in this world as um, beings of change in a world that's given over to change, like so much of our experience of the world is chaotic. And so I think that first of all, what we need to do is we need to find some place of stability. Like we need anchoring. We need to learn something about who it is that we are, let alone something, more fundamental, like what is the world like? And so I think that part of what we do is, okay, we need to stop and ask, like, what even is truth, right? Like, what even is reality? Because before we have some framework for addressing those major forms, that we don't really have any framework for filling them with content, right? Most of the time, people just jump right into content without
Mhm.
even asking the question of what is the form of truth? Like, what is the form of goodness? And at that point, you aren't like filling vessels of knowledge. You essentially are just, you are the vessel being filled with something come from somewhere else. I was actually just talking about this in one of my classes today about the difference between musing and being amused, right? When you muse on something, well, you're thinking in line with the muses, which, the muses were the daughters of Zeus who would inspire truth, goodness, and beauty in the artisans and poets and whatnot. And so to muse on something, you're paying attention to the wisdom that is implicit in an idea, or at least you're using an idea to move in the direction of wisdom. Whereas when you're being amused, well, that a prefix means like against. You're not musing. Your musing capabilities are actually being severed. Instead of feeding on something, you are being fed on, right? And so I think that part of how we break through from the propaganda is we stop simply allowing ourselves to be amused and we learn how to muse properly in the direction of what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful.
I'm wondering what you would say is the role of something like philosophy and literature, and maybe they have those disciplines have separate roles in our lives in helping us to break out of our days and actually become real people.
Well, I think the questions of philosophy and literature, to me at least, they do have more or less the same driving force behind them.
Mm.
It's been said that the beginning of philosophy is wonder, and I think that that's kind of where it starts. That first we have to break out of our postmodern self-referential tendencies, right? We're told constantly, day in and day out, through media, through philosophy, politicians, just wherever, even in our churches, that you just need to live your truth. You need to speak your truth. The most important thing you could do is to be authentic without even asking the question, authentic to what? And so I think that beginning with the perspective that we are not the center of reality, but that we take part in a story beyond ourselves. Well, that's what leads us to the kind of wonder that causes us to ask questions like, not just what do I feel about this, but what is the world really like? And then what role do I have to play in that story that's been playing before I stepped into the scene and will play after I leave the scene? What is that bigger picture? And as we move in that direction, well, now we actually have a reason for wonder, a reason for genuine curiosity to develop a better understanding of the way things are, and by extent, the place that we have within that world. And I think that's what philosophy, the right kind of philosophy, the love of wisdom, that's what it does. Just as good literature is also going to have that impact, and that it's going to expand our vision. It's going to take the apparently mundane and re-enchant it with that sense of wonder and curiosity that is actually a more real way of engaging with even our primary world experience. And so I think that the right use of philosophy and the right use of literature go hand in hand in doing the same thing, re-enchanting us to the glory that is the world in which we live.
How do people come from an existence that is essentially comprised of propaganda and the acceptance of propaganda? What breaks people out of that to be able to experience wonder? Because it seems to me that one of the things we could say about the ideological man is that he's defined by his inability to experience wonder.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. And I mean, obviously, part of it comes down to disposition. That's not all of it, but some people are naturally going to be given more over to wonder, to that kind of openness that is engaged with wonder.
Right.
I can tell you that, even before I studied philosophy, long before I discovered literature, which I discovered relatively, later in life, not during my childhood, even as a teenager, like I definitely had a romantic spark to myself. Where growing up in Virginia Beach, I mean, sometimes, even as a teenager, I just go to the beach at sunrise just to look at it rise up over the ocean. And I didn't even know why, other than it was just beautiful. And so I've
Hmm.
always had that kind of romantic streak in my spirit. Now,
Same here. You might be surprised to learn.
and so I can only speak so much on how to ignite that if you're somebody who just doesn't have it at all. But I think I mean, a bad place to start isn't by, well, start reading good books and start studying things that are worth studying. I think that when you look at something that is glorious, something that is beautiful, and you're really looking at it, you can't help but to let it evoke something within your heart, unless you're intentionally closing yourself off from that. It's hard to, go to a great art museum and to look at great art and not have it do something for you, unless you're intentionally trying to hold it at bay. And so I think that the first step is just by starting to introduce beautiful things into your life, which, I mean, a lot of people, most people perhaps, don't do that. And so instead, they're inundated with all kinds of ugliness of propaganda and whatnot. And so the first place to start might be just introducing some beautiful things into your life. Read a good story, start looking at art. I mean, just listen to some good music. I think
Mhm.
it's not a bad place to start.
It brings so many things to mind. I wrote a tweet today saying that in the last couple of months, there have been two videos that have come across my feed that I've watched probably 500 times each. One is King Charles reciting God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley
Hmm.
Hopkins, and the fabulous lines: "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil."
There it
It doesn't
is.
get better than that, right?
Yeah.
And the other video was Freddie Freeman's walk-off grand slam at the World Series this year. And part of the point of the tweet was that that's kind of a joke, is because they seem at some level opposed to one another, right? What does the greatest of English poetry have to do with baseball? But in fact, now that we're talking, we I can see the underlying connection there is that they're both these sorts of wondrous things, right? Like no human being should be able to write a poem like that. And just like what? How many people could hit that home run? Almost none. And I'm wondering if part of what wakes people up is just some experience of excellence. And maybe that's part of the reason we are such a sports crazy culture, is because that's one of the places where one of the only places like a lot of people ever experience any sense of awe or wonder is at like the top of really, really good athletic events.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense that greatness inspires within us a desire for greatness that is only met by greatness. And so the more that we behold great things, the more of a hunger we have for it, whether that be in sports or the arts or wherever. And obviously, a lot of the draw of modern sports pulls from the same spirit that leads to gladiatorial combat, or the glory that was once won only through war. Like those
Right.
kinds of old glories are still very much alive today, even if they take different manifestations. But they speak to some, I think, fundamental desire that we all have for greatness.
And because there's a sense in which excellence is meaning, right? And people are so hungry for that. And yet, meaning is difficult to access for many people because they just don't have any ability to work for it.
Right. But I mean, I've come to experience, in teaching at a state university, teaching philosophy classes, that as you said, people are very much hungry for it, but they don't even really know that
Mm,
it's there. But a lot of times in the first week of class or so, I'll be talking about Plato's allegory of the cave, which is where intro to philosophy class very often starts, and for good reason. But,
mhm,
I start asking them questions like, okay, what are some good things to do? And they'll list off some things that are good things to do. I mean, charity, have justice, whatever. And then I ask them, okay, what is the good that makes good things good? And
mm,
it's usually at that point, and that's an extended conversation because I have to really lead them up to that point. But once we get there and they recognize the importance of that conversation, that's when things start to open up to them. Like, oh, maybe there actually is something like goodness, and that my entirely self-referential model doesn't account for my basic experience of the world, things that I actually know to be true, but propaganda has convinced me otherwise.
mm,
And so once they recognize that, it becomes actually exciting to recognize that maybe they are not the center of reality, that maybe there are things that exist above and beyond them that can actually give their life meaning, that maybe hierarchy as such is not inherent evil, but actually the pathway to meaning.
mhm.
And people find that, I mean, well, I guess not all people, but many people find that exhilarating when that starts to open up as a possibility to them, because now they actually have somewhere to go.
I find that a lot too with music. I'm a big appreciator of classical music, for example. Not that I would pretend to know anything about it, but I know I like it, and I try to evangelize about it. And I hear over and over people say, "Well, I don't understand it. I don't know how to get into it. I need someone to explain it to me." And I always think, "No, you don't. You really don't, because you're here is this here is a piece by Rachmaninoff, who's very easy to appreciate. Might not be easy to understand, but his melodies are unique and they're very modern sounding and they're beautiful. And I always want to say to people, just listen. That's all there is to it. And I'm wondering, what it is that prevents people, like you said, there's this treasure trove of riches there that give people's lives meaning, and yet they've been convinced in some way to stay away from them. Have you encountered that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, absolutely, because it becomes threatening
Mm-hmm.
to think that there's something worth giving myself over to.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose it is too that in order to say, I don't know anything about, say, classical music, but I know that when I listen to some certain pieces of music, I have essentially like a spiritual experience. Something happens deep inside of me that is good. And I suppose it's threatening to say, I'm just going to do that even though I don't know what I'm doing. And it's the same with trying to wade into philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, there's just this discomfort at doing things that I mean, you don't know what you're engaging with. You can't control it. You can't manage it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's a reason why most people today won't answer a phone call when their phone rings,
Mm-hmm.
and that I don't want to engage with the other because I want to maintain the internal safety of just being me without even asking the question of like, who even am I?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really good. Is that all these things in a way through, I suppose if you've built yourself a false self within the framework of the propaganda you've been given, all the all these examples of greatness we're talking about sort of are constantly threatening to kind of tear against that. And
Right.
at any moment, Rachmaninoff could slip into your room and destroy you if you weren't careful.
Right. I mean, to recognize greatness in any capacity, I mean, such as the greatness of, the classical composer or whoever, um, you have to recognize that you are not great, at least in the same
Mm.
domain that you're dealing with. And so it requires a level of humility to recognize greatness. And it's the very humility that's going to lead to meaning and will actually make you better for it. It will move you in the direction of greatness to recognize the greatness that is above you. But it does require a level of humility that, unfortunately, sinful human nature, as well as the propaganda of our culture, really just does not lead us to adopt.
Hmm. And it seems to me that that humility is directly related to happiness. That you can't, that somehow recognizing greatness that is above you is an important part of being a happy person. And it's evident even in baseball, right? Because literally you can watch whatever baseball game and you see guys who are performing at a level that 99.9% of all men in the world could not do. And then you get on baseball Twitter, and immediately afterward, you got a bunch of guys who literally couldn't run around the block telling you what they would have done.
Right.
And it's that's the threatening part, right? Like those guys are bitter and unhappy because they can't recognize the greatness that's above them. What can you explain that? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really easy. I mean, excuse me, envy is way easier than humility, right? And so it's easy when greatness is presented to you to, instead of recognizing that, this greatness is something to behold, and in looking at it, you yourself become greater. It's much easier just out of envy to tear people down to your level instead of aspiring to rise up to their level. Whether it's you actually becoming great in some capacity of yourself or simply in, setting your vision up on their level. Either way, it's far easier just to bring them down to your level. And C.S. Lewis talks about this a lot, both in his fiction and nonfiction, that democracy may be an important political institution for preventing tyranny and whatnot, but it's not actually the way that things are. And
Mm.
if we treat reality democratically, then we actually eliminate greatness because we're going to end up lowering everything to the lowest common denominator. And we already see that in so many aspects of culture, education, et cetera, because that holistic democracy mentality and that we're going to bring everything down to the same level. I mean, it's easy to do that because it doesn't require any kind of greatness of ourselves. And I
Mm.
think that just is our natural tendency to give ourselves over to envy.
I think too that part of the happiness that comes from a humility to meaning a willingness to recognize a greatness beyond what you yourself could do. Again, to go back to the example of music, is that when I listen to certain pieces of classical music, I think to myself, a human being thought that. This like absolutely beautiful, transcendent thing. I mean, what even is music? It's just a bunch of sounds and sounds in order. That's it. But it's also like the highest possible art form that elevates people out of themselves. And I think a human being thought this. Like you and I, we go to the grocery store and we think, where are the pickles? Beethoven was walking around the grocery store and he thought of the Ninth Symphony.
Right.
And I find that when I think in that way, there's a great comfort in that because it's clear that there is a spirit in the world that gives these kinds of greatness to some people for the benefit of the rest of us. And fortunately, I don't have to be Beethoven. Do you know what I'm saying? And I mean, Beethoven was an unhappy guy, as was many of the people who produce these great works. And but I think many people miss the comfort of knowing their place kind of in that hierarchy and how these great works of art are there for them no matter who they are.
Right. And I mean, the beauty, and it's forms that it takes. Real beauty,
Mm.
it awakens love in the soul. And what love does is it makes you more expansive as you're able to give yourself over to this reality that is above and beyond you. And in that, giving yourself over to that which is worth giving yourself over to, well, you become more of a person. You become more of what you're meant to be, and that does lead to something like happiness, understood in the classical sense of eudaimonia, the good life, the way that life should be. I mean, to make it really simple, G.K. Chesterton said that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Take it, yes, and I guess the modern propagandized person has everything backward in that way. He does not take he takes himself seriously and Beethoven lightly. And he'd do better to
Right.
do it the other way around.
Right, exactly, and this really gets to major differences between pre-modern and postmodern thinking. In that, in the pre-moderns, whether you're talking the Christian medievals or the pre-Christian pagans of Greece, Rome, wherever, that there was this idea that um, there is a reality into which we must contextualize ourselves, as opposed to the modern and then increasingly in the postmodern world where that gets flipped. And now our task is to contextualize reality into ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a totally different orientation. One is giving of the self, one is consuming of everything else.
And I think it's important at this point to make a distinction between the way that certain people talk glibly of the self in sort of the postmodern context, by which they essentially mean simply your impulses. That the self is really reduced to your impulses. Like you are being authentic when you are essentially a slave to your impulses. Right.
Right. I
As
mean,
opposed to a different view of the self. I'm sorry, go ahead.
right. Right. I mean, Augustine says in the City of God that, the good man, though a slave, is free, whereas the tyrant, though free, is a slave. And what's much worse, he's a slave to as many masters as he has vices.
Mm.
Now, that version of the tyrant is exactly what we're told the self is, right? You just do whatever you want. You get folks like, Jean-Paul Sartre, who says that there is no human essence, that we are continually defining what we are through our everlasting becoming.
Mm.
Now, there's a major problem with that, in that on one hand, he's going to say there's no such thing as a priori or as like a stable human self. There's no human essence, is the best word there. But at the same time, he's going to say that we should all be authentic, which that raises the problem of, if there's no such thing as an essential human self, then what, first of all, what right does he have to tell us to be anything such as authentic? And also, what does the word authentic even mean? Like, authentic to what?
Right.
Yourself?
Every choice is equally authentic
Correct.
if there's no larger moral framework and there's nothing you're supposed to be.
Which means that if we adopt that model, it's really a lack of a model, right? It's continual nothingness with no port in sight.
Mm.
And that just leads to so much absurdity. And in fact, the whole system, in my reckoning, is propaganda, in that it forces you to set aside most basic realities of human experience in the world, such as our basic moral impulses. When I start the semester, most of my state university students will tell me that there's no such thing as truth, goodness is all opinion, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll ask them things like, how many of you are fans of justice? Like, everyone raises their hand and they don't see an issue with that right away. Or I'll
Right.
ask them, right after they tell me that, everything just comes down to opinion. Okay, how many of you intend to vote this election? Most of them raise their hand. And then I ask them, like, do you not see any inconsistency in that you say that everything's just opinion? The worst thing you can do is to push your opinion on someone else. But at the same time, you're voting on the ideology that's going to be imposed on your neighbors. And so it's like the things that they say they believe are not what they actually believe in practice. That to live as this continually self-creating postmodern, you have to imbibe so much propaganda that forces you to set aside the most obvious realities of human experience in this world. And in that sense, it seems very inauthentic.
And this is why, this is, in my mind, a big part of why we live in an age where depression and anxiety are out of control, because we live in a world where the official worldview requires you to disconnect from what you know in your gut is true.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that was a kind of the lead up to my dissertation on Kierkegaard's take on anxiety, despair, and becoming a self. I definitely believe that the radical rates of anxiety disorders, depression, even youth suicide, it has to, at least in part, stem from the just absurdity of the ideology that's pushed on people from such a young age through media, even through education.
Mhm.
People are taught to live in direct opposition to their basic human nature, and that absurdity results in not being in tune with the way that things are, which results in radical anxiety and depression and even suicide.
Mhm. And and then when you compound that with the sort of traumatic experiences or strained relationships that are just also part of human nature, what you end up getting is you get a lot of people who are, number one, blind to the way they've been propagandized, and two, motivated to push things into their to become unconscious of the things that are hurting them. And so they rely even more on sort of the propaganda because they can't be honest about what is actually happened, but their own experience. So that's repressed. They rely more on the propaganda that fails them, and so eventually you just end up as this being floating like a ghost through life, bouncing back and forth between stressful work and the next entertainment experience.
Right. And you're at this point, you're predisposed to any kind of pathways of wisdom that can break you out of that and lead to a better life. Because even the idea that there is such a thing as a better way of living, it becomes a source of threat. It becomes hostile to you because of the propaganda that you've imbibed.
And they become, I suppose, inured to beauty even. And this is
Yeah.
why they are indifferent to beauty.
Yeah, I think of in C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, the way that he portrays hell, it's the gray town. And so it's been robbed of beauty. And what's really typifies his version of hell is that it's radically isolated in that the people can't stand to be with each other. And so for all of eternity, everyone's moving further and further and further away in their homes, which themselves are objects of their own delusions. And so nothing is really real there. Everything is artificial, and you are radically alone and isolated. And of course, in doing that, he's not only giving us a like eschatological picture, he's more fundamentally giving a critique of our cultural age, which, in its hyper individualistic, you live your truth mentality, you become totally isolated. You become isolated from other people because you've each created your own reality at this point. There's no connection point. And so if you find yourself lost in despair, like there's nowhere to go because you've been taught your whole life that everything is centered within you. And that means there's literally no escape.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned several times C.S. Lewis. What books do you teach people to help them break out of this, to help them be
Oh,
what they ought to be what they are?
well, actually, right now I am making my students read The Great Divorce.
Uh huh.
Um,
That's
so
my
that,
favorite Lewis book.
yeah, I mean, for good reason. It's definitely up there for me. I mean, so that's a good one, but really, I mostly stick with, you know, classical philosophy for my classes. We don't really read any secondary works, and so we recently read Plato's Phaedo, which is all about death and the immortality of the soul. We spend most of our time actually on the pre-moderns. I give a little lip service to the postmoderns, that way they get a better understanding of like what's being taught today. But we mostly spend our time with pre-modern philosophy.
Mm.
Things like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. One thing that I really like about Marcus Aurelius is that repeatedly throughout his meditations, he just very straightforward says things like, you already know what makes for a good life. Just go and do it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people really just need to recognize that if they're honest with themselves, they know what responsibilities they have in their life as students, as friends, as family members, as employees, various contexts. Like they know what's required of them. What they need to do is just go and do those things. And as they do those things, they'll find that their life gets markedly better. And in fact, they start to develop a better understanding of what the pathway to meaning is. I mean, obviously, my public university classes, I'm not going to be as like explicit theologically, but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, simply by telling them that you know what you need to do, go do it. That seems to play a pretty significant role in helping them to get a sense of what the pathway to meaning looks like on a very practical level.
So many people, and I find this a lot in sort of doing coaching and counseling work. So many people need to have the pathway to self trust, to trusting those basic intuitions cleared for them. Now, I suppose there are multiple ways to do that, but one of the way, so when I'm working with someone kind of in a coaching or counseling capacity, I always am looking for this moment when the eyes get big and people take a sharp breath. Because at that point, I know they suddenly connected to it. They feel it and they know that what that feeling means. And I suppose that philosophy and the arts are maybe a more subtle way of doing that. But we just live in a time where people have to have that cleared for them in a way. To like you say, to say, you know what to do it.
Yeah. I'm currently teaching a course called Life, Death, and Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of intro level philosophy cross-listed with religion course, but specifically focused on how do we have a life of meaning relative to the fact that we're going to die. So it's a great premise for a course of dealing with college students, making them confront that reality. And I always begin the course with Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which really just this phenomenal short story of a man who if he doesn't really have any clear direction in life other than trying to meet the demands of the upper society he's trying to identify with, until he starts to recognize that he's going to die. He injures himself and punctures a organ or something, and his sickness keeps getting worse and worse. And he convinces himself it's not really that bad, and he goes back and forth debating his own mortality with himself, essentially, till eventually it becomes evident he's going to die. And at that point, he just goes through just this spiral of kind of his life falling apart, his body falling apart. Psychologically, he's haunted by the reality of his impending death, but he's never really even known what life is. And so he doesn't have anything to do with that until he gets to the very end, at which point he has he takes communion kind of against his will, but just because that's what you do before you die. But then in his like dying breath, he recognizes that he did everything wrong. He's able to engage in a kind of repentance, and he's
Mm-hmm.
able to kind of have the reality of the communion that he took kind of passively sort of works his way out in the very last moments. And that story does such a great job of portraying what it's like for somebody to, against their will, engage with the reality of their mortality.
Mm-hmm.
And you get very real psychological spiraling brought into a final consolation at the very end. And what I help my students to recognize is that Tolstoy is not just giving us the story of a guy who got a terminal diagnosis, but essentially he's giving us the human story, recognizing that to be mortal means you're going to die. We
Mm-hmm.
all have that fate in common. And if we don't start now, not knowing when the end is coming, but knowing it's coming relatively soon, all things considered, like if we don't start taking our lives seriously, then, well, maybe we never will. And
Mm-hmm.
simply coming to terms with mortality, I think, is a powerful motivator toward the life of meaning. Because, I mean, if we're honest, we tend to think that life is pretty much going to go on as it is right now indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we know logically that death is coming, it's not something that we are convinced is really going to happen to us. Um, he even Tolstoy in Ivan Ilyich has Ivan Ilyich say that, I remember from my logic class that, okay, so and so is mortal, mortals die, therefore so and so is going to die. But I didn't think that had anything to do with me. And
Mm,
I think that what literature can often serve to do is to bridge that gap of what we think we know to confronting it as a concrete reality before us.
mm,
I recently read a book by Peter Kraft where he said that, a philosophy that can't be made into a good story is not a good philosophy. And
mm,
so part of what a good story does is it makes us confront good philosophy.
mm, Very interesting. Yes, and I suppose the Ivan Illich thing there is that he wishes he had been better at the end.
Right. He's finally able to engage in a kind of repentance that he never would have been able to do apart from his impending death.
It reminds me. I don't know if you're how familiar you might be with Flannery O'Connor's story. A good man is hard to find, but it's about a serial killer who basically pulls a family over on a drive. They're on vacation, kills them all. And one of the characters is called I think it's called the grand. She's called the grandmother, and the killer is called the misfit. And just before the killer kills the grandmother, she essentially shows a kind of repentance as well. And the misfit has this, because it's Flannery O'Connor, the most profound Christian lines always come from the most disturbing characters. Uh, the misfit says something like, she'd have been a good woman if she'd had somebody there to shoot her in the head every minute of her life. And it's sort of making the same point that
Hmm.
had she been constantly reminded of her temporariness and her fragility, that she would have tried harder to do right. And I
Right. I
suppose
mean,
when I say to do right, I also mean to live in a meaningful way.
right. I mean, that's the memento mori idea, right? Remember that you will die.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, the more often that we remember the fact that we are mortal, well, the more priority we're at least hopefully going to place on living intentionally, recognizing that our time is limited. Tolkien said in I think it was a BBC interview that all stories are ultimately stories about one thing, the inevitability of death,
Mm-hmm.
because all stories deal with people, mortals, all human stories at least, are deal with mortals. And to be mortal means that we only have a set number of things that we can do, breaths that we can take, actions we can make before we die. That all those things are limited, they are finite. And recognizing that finitude makes us to recognize the importance of each moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are the books you use in your class about life, death, and meaning?
Oh, so we do use Plato. We talk Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics a little bit about living the good life through reason and virtue. It also connects to the question of like, what does it mean to be a human?
Mm,
Like I said, we tend to orient around pre-modern texts because I think that they're more authentic in that the pre-moderns tend to ask, okay, what is human experience in this world like? And then how do we account for that? And so it's
yeah.
actually a very human approach, as
Mm,
opposed to the postmoderns, which again tend to work against that and suppress that. They ask something like, "What is the reality like?" And then, um, what does that mean for us?
I
And then it becomes artificial.
I remember as an undergraduate having that moment of realization. No one explained it very clearly to me, but I remember thinking, wait a second, there are two kinds of philosophy. There is one kind that begins with an abstraction, and one kind that experiences something in the world and begins with that experience. And I remember being 20 and thinking, I like the kind that begins with experience more.
Right. And this is why I'd really think that modern philosophy, I mean, starting with Descartes, that things really went downhill from there. I mean,
Mhm.
Pascal says this about Descartes. He says, I can never forgive Descartes because the way that he made use of God or really any world beyond himself, it became a product of his reasoning rather than the foundation. And that's a
Mm,
very dangerous issue. that Descartes, yeah, I mean, he tried to reason his way to the existence of God, the existence of the world around him, but it was a
Mhm.
product of his reasoning, not the foundation. And what that means is that the root of modern philosophy, you don't have God, you don't have the world, you have yourself. It's
Mhm.
not a very big step from that to Jean-Paul Sartre saying, all you have is yourself abandoned in the world.
And even in Descartes, what you have yourself, but it is a very flimsy sort of self. It's not the
Right.
same as a self in Aquinas, for example.
Correct. And there's question as to whether Descartes legitimately even has a self at all in his philosophy. That's why
Mhm.
you jump to David Hume,
Mhm.
following in as setting the foundations for modern thought. And he's going to say that you actually don't even have a reason to believe you have a self. All you have is this plethora of sense experience that's fed into, well, not even fed into anything. It's just there because you can't empirically verify that you have anything like a soul, like you have a self that endures across time. All you have is this collection of sense data. And so at this point, you lose even the self. And he raises the question, does even Descartes have a idea of a self legitimately? And I
Mhm.
would argue that he probably doesn't, given where he starts. Now, as far as who else I use in my class, also I always use Beowulf as well. I think that's
Mhm.
has
How
some powerful
come?
things to say. Well, as I think Tolkien got it right on the head when in his essay, "The Monsters and the Critics," which deals with Beowulf, when he said that the story of Beowulf, it's not a heroic lay per se. It's first and foremost a story about mortality. It's a story about how to live in the face of death. And to that extent, Beowulf is a symbol of the human experience, in that, this is a guy who is, I mean, we've got our Christian poet telling us the story about these pre-Christian Scandinavians. And so we're very much in the northern mythos here, despite the fact that it's being given to us by a Christian. And in the northern mythos, you've got the big competition at play between the gods on one side and the noble men who fight on their side. You've got the monsters on the other side, these agents of chaos that are just seeking to destroy the world essentially. And there's this belief that in the end, the monsters are going to win, the gods are
Mhm.
going to lose. And so the Northern heroism is a heroism that doesn't fight actually for eternal victory. They fight for the victory of the day, recognizing that, yeah, maybe one day the endless winter will come. But until then, we have fire in our halls, and we have an obligation to fight with our backs against the wall, to defend what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, to defend what is human experience as long as we possibly can, recognizing that, yeah, maybe in the end it is going to be futile, but for right now it's not. And so even in the story of Beowulf, you get this hero who's fighting back the monsters, Grendel's mother, and eventually he gives his life in defeating the dragon. But then at the end of the story, despite all of this great deeds that Beowulf had done, um, there's this expectation that now with King Beowulf dead, the Swedes and some of the other enemies are about to sweep in and destroy his people. And so there's this sense that despite the futility that's associated with mortality, we still have reason to do meaningful things even in the here and now. And in doing that, we actually maybe even start to develop a relationship with the eternal.
Mhm.
And that's where Tolkien takes the northern mythos and kind of baptizes it,
Mhm.
where we fight with a sense of futility relative to this world with the hope of an unexpected turn at the end.
I've seen you mention Boethius several times. Does he have anything to say about any of this?
I would say that he does. Uh, yeah, and so I love using him in my medieval philosophy class, which I teach every few semesters or so. We read that in its entirety, and I've even started including at least book one in my intro to philosophy class to spark the conversation as to what he's doing with that. Um, and so, for anyone listening who's not familiar with Boethius, I mean, Boethius was a Roman senator following the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, and so he's living as a Roman under the barbarian rule.
Mhm.
Even more so, the barbarian ruler is a Arian. He is a Trinitarian Catholic, and so there are all kinds of issues there. But nonetheless, this is a guy Boethius who lived a good life by any reasonable way of looking at it. He even was like a personal advisor to his barbarian king, but things turned against him. He uncovered some corruption, and eventually some of his colleagues formed some accusations against him that he was conspiring with the Eastern Roman Empire to essentially come and retake Western Rome. He was also accused of witchcraft and like all kinds of things, just these charges to get him out of the way. So then he finds himself stripped of his fortune in prison, awaiting what will eventually be his death sentence. And he's left wondering, despite the fact that like I've done everything reasonably that I should have done in life, but yet here I am. How do I make sense of my relationship to fortune? And how do I find happiness when everything seems to be stripped away from me? And so it's such a profound account that he gives us as he goes about seeking the answers to that question, which I think is a question that many of us either have asked or at least should ask ourselves. How do we find happiness in a world that's constantly given over to change?
How do we find happiness in a world that's constantly given over to change?
Well, what Boethius does with that is, okay, first we have to recognize that yes, fortune does change, and there's a reason why Lady Fortune is generally portrayed as being blind, and that she doesn't really care about you, right? She spins her wheel, and maybe you'll get the $1 million, maybe you'll go bankrupt. You don't have a lot of control over that. But what you do have control over is the way that you're relating to fortune itself. And so part of that process is learning that it doesn't matter what fortune spins your way. As Boethius says, all fortune is good fortune for the good man.
Mm.
Because, if what we conventionally think of as good fortune, you get that raise or whatever, I mean, things seem to be going well for you in life. Well, you hold that with an open hand, and you can use those resources to do good things, but you recognize they aren't actually yours. They are yours for a season. You keep them in an open hand. At the other side, you lose your job unexpectedly. You get that terminal diagnosis. Whatever happens, fortune seems to be spinning against you. Well, that's also good for you because now you can just double down on what is stable and what is enduring. And eventually we come to realize what that is the goodness of God that is reflected in human nature. And so we have that direct tether to ultimate, like capital M meaning itself, in that we, temporal creatures living in a world of change, have an intrinsic relationship to the eternal goodness of God. And that's where we find stability relative to the moving fortunes around us.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk just for a minute about what you're doing let's end on that note and let you tell people where to find you and tell people what the Mythic Mind Fellowship is.
Yeah, and so the Mythic Mind Fellowship is something that's really just born out of my very broad interest in the humanities. My academic background is in philosophy and theology, and even the theology is very much in a philosophical direction. But within the last few years, I won't go into the whole story at this point. I know you probably need to get to bed, but
Good.
I just in the last few years, really, became awakened to the value of good stories, of literature. And so I started making up for lost time, just reading. I mean, starting with Tolkien to Lewis, and then various things kind of at the root there. I mean, myths and stories and legends and whatever, all sorts of different things I've been reading. And I just wanted to form a community that is also interested very broadly in the humanities and history, philosophy, literature, politics, wherever. And so I've kind of put together this group that's kind of fed through my Patreon into Discord and then beyond. And out of that, I've been spinning off some independently led classes. So far, I started off with a course on the philosophy and fiction of C.S. Lewis that ran through really all of his major works of fiction. And that had about 60 participants in the first run. And so that gave me good energy to think, yeah, I need to keep doing this sort of thing. And so from there, we did a class on Boethius and Beowulf, Life, Death, and Meaning with Beowulf and Boethius. And now we're gearing up to do a Tolkien class in January. And so there's a lot of energy going behind that. And you can look me up on Twitter at Andrew Snyder, or you can go to patreon.com/mythicmind. And between those two places, I mean, that's good enough way to contact me and to keep up with the various things that I'm doing.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. One of the great frustrations of doing these conversations is that almost never do I feel like we've done anything but barely scratch the surface. And so I'm always asking people to come back and let's do it again.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
All right. Thank you again.